Hi there, friend. My name is John Werner. I used to be a part of the largest cult in the United States. After studying the Bible, Christian history, and ministry, I set my sights on confronting the problematic nature of white evangelicalism in the United States. In 2019, I published my first book as a first step in addressing the subtle issues of this complex system. This podcast will continue that work under the same title. Welcome to The Cult of Christianity.
Netflix's documentary series, How to Become a Cult Leader, might as well have been called Famous Cult Leaders Drive-By Edition. With Peter Dinklage serving as our guide, these concise 6 episodes, each a mere half-hour in duration, embark on the curious endeavor of sketching thumbnail portraits of 6 eccentric purveyors of cult followings. These caricatures of what makes an average cult leader do little more than a Wikipedia entry, but are at least presented creatively, a presumptuous nod to your latent desire, dear viewer, to step into the shoes of a cult leader. This series unfolds as your personal playbook, replete with tactics to obtain your own cult following. Within the Netflix limited series, How to Become a Cult Leader, we cross paths with the likes of Charles Manson, Jim Jones, Jaime Gomez of the Buddha Field, Marshall Applewhite of his Heaven's Gate, Shimrinko's Shoko Ashihara, and the Unification Church's Reverend Sun Young Moon. How to Become a Cult Leader becomes the latest chapter in Netflix's ongoing series of How to Become, preceded by the foray into How to Become a Tyrant in 2021, with a forthcoming How to Become a Mob Boss slated for 2024. Amidst the abundant archival footage showcasing these deranged personalities, the series rather predictably leans on the cliched crutch of stock footage and cultural tropes to punctuate its musings. For instance, when discussing Applewhite, whose out there belief in his adherents' cosmic ascension were thrust into the world of campy scenes from budget-strained 1950s sci-fi cinema. In contrast, the series did have helpful and imaginative animations, a portal into the intimate decisions of these cult leaders that elude the constraints of conventional video archives. That was well done and intriguing. Also, the subject matter experts, including former cult member and podcast host Lola Blanc and the astute ex-FBI agent Asha Rangappa, make their appearances to proffer insights. Yet, these elucidations come in a rather rudimentary vein, devoid of intricate specifics, rather generalities that are incomplete or disjointed from the narration of the series. The overarching facetiousness of the series appears a trifle discordant when juxtaposed against the horrors these cult leaders caused. The act of doling out strategic suggestions through bite-sized cult tactics such as tend to your flock, codify your doctrine, expand your dominion, is reductive at best. Peter Dinklage, the familiar voice we've come to know and love, not only narrates the documentary, but also holds the reins as an executive producer. His playful, sarcastic, and mischievous tone is akin to a card player who's got an ace hidden up their sleeve. But it does come off cringy when you place that against a backdrop of straightforward and sincere documentary visuals, the kind you typically encounter when exploring a serious and dark subject matter. It's a concoction that falls somewhere between off-key melodies and quips aimed more at being clever than caring. Stylistic choices aside, one of my primary critiques centers around the lack of attention to the misconceptions surrounding individuals within cults. It doesn't even touch on born and raised members, who often bear a distinct set of challenges, and the aftermath of leaving such an environment can be complex and difficult. Those born into cults were given zero attention. The satirical element of the documentary, while aiming to engage the audience, struck me as disrespectful to survivors who have lived through the very situations being portrayed. The series does have its redeeming qualities. Experts and survivors like Rachel Bernstein, Dr. Lalick, and Radhia Gleis bring much needed educational context and lived experiences to the table. They are the highlights, without a doubt. Their insights offer a more comprehensive understanding of the subject matter, providing a counterbalance to the more frivolous tone of the documentary. However, a glaring issue emerges in the opening moments when cults are defined as extremist based on the narcissism of one leader and necessarily deadly. This claim, while perhaps fitting for the cults portrayed in the documentary, unfortunately perpetuates a common misconception. In reality, most cults remain under the radar of public attention, often dismissed as harmless variations of belief. I reached out to Casey, my friend from the Cult Vault podcast, as she has interviewed over 300 cult survivors and is an expert in her own right. I asked if she had seen the series and what her thoughts were, and she felt similar, saying, quote, "What does harm our work and leaves me shaking my head was a guy in the first 5 minutes saying something so inaccurate along the lines of most cults end in death and bloodshed. No, these cults on this show, which is why they are being used as material, and in my opinion have been covered far too much and feed into what most people think cults look like. Actually, it's quite the opposite. Most go unnoticed by the wider public, ignored for religious freedom, or written off as they are just a group of people with different beliefs in mind. Nothing harmful there." End quote. I could not agree with Casey more. The cults most we're talking about are not the most sensational. While they are no less tragic or toxic, their impact is fetishized, taking away important conversations about how powerful systems that allow such abuse remain unchecked. This Netflix series, How to Become a Cult Leader, sometimes refers to cults as pseudo-religious, but that's a bit of a misspeak. In reality, cults necessarily have some religious traits and dynamics. They often have pastor-like leaders, offer comprehensive worldviews, engage in rituals, and foster a sense of community and belonging among members. The term pseudo-religious might stem from a desire to highlight cults' negative aspects, but it oversimplifies the fact that they have religious-like characteristics and might even imply that religions are the good side of cults. It's important to recognize that cults aren't pseudo-religious. They are religious. Of course, what this really points out is that subjective terms like religion or cult are not apt enough to be universally agreed upon. We all mean different things when we say these words. But this series defined cults in two problematic ways: by the cult leader and by what scandalous stuff the cult leader did. Defining a cult solely by its leader, especially by labeling them as a charismatic leader, can be problematic as it oversimplifies the intricate dynamics and structures that contribute to the formation and functioning of cults. While it's true that charismatic leadership often plays a role in cults, focusing solely on this aspect fails to capture the broader factors that shape these groups and their impact. First, the term charismatic leader can sometimes romanticize or glamorize the role of the leader, making it seem like an admirable trait. It is possible that charismatic leaders in cults manipulate their followers through charm and persuasion, exploiting vulnerabilities for personal gain. But I've met some boring pastors. The manipulation, coercion, and harm that these leaders inflict on their followers is not dependent on their charisma, sometimes not even dependent on their intrinsic power. Cult ideology lends itself to listening to a leader, whether or not they exhibit any charm at all. The charisma is in the message. Secondly, a narrow focus on the leader overlooks the intricate social, psychological, and organizational mechanisms that underpin cult dynamics. Cults are rarely the product of a single individual. They emerge from a complex interplay of beliefs, social isolation, groupthink, and psychological manipulation. This framing can lead to a reductionist understanding of the phenomenon, ignoring the power structures, rituals, and communal practices that keep cults functioning. Furthermore, centering the definition on the leader can perpetuate a stereotype that all cult members are passive followers who are blindly swayed by a charismatic figure. In reality, cult members often come from diverse backgrounds and join for a variety of reasons, not to mention the ones being born into these groups through no choice of their own. Focusing only on the leader overlooks the agency and personal histories of these individuals. The docuseries also defines cults by their extremes. Let me explain. I call Christianity a cult for a living. The KKK formed as and currently is a Christian group. I think that's worth mentioning. But I frame it as looking at what is possible under the Christian cult. A group like the KKK can use Christian language and frameworks to justify their ideology. But the KKK's ideology is not what defines Christianity, at least completely. Christianity is not the same thing as white supremacy, even if I believe that Christianity breeds it. Likewise, cults are not defined by any particular death, sex, or suicide group that pops up randomly. They are not defined by a narcissistic leader alone. Cults lend themselves to such things, but that is not what they are. Now, this series had a few narrative tools that it employed. The overarching one is in the title, as it appeals to some sort of cultural obsession with true crime and tonality. The idea is that this is how you, implying anyone, could become a cult leader. Let me at the outset say this. I'm not sure anyone could become a cult leader. I am sure anyone could become a cult follower. And this is coming from someone who was both. But I'll circle back to that later. The episode titles are a sort of step-by-step guide to ascending to cult leader stardom, each episode using a real-life example to center on, while peppering in references to other cult leaders. Episode 1 is titled Build Your Foundation, which takes you on the transformative journey of Charles Manson from his origins as a minor criminal and folk rock artist. The doc vaguely mentions his evolution into an infamous figure of murder. Along the way, the documentary mentions different tactics, but they aren't easy to remember and seem particularly specific to each episode, taking away from any intent to make you believe that these tactics are universal. In episode 2, titled Grow Your Flock, the series takes on a journey into the life of Jim Jones. It explores the path of the man driven by messianic self-belief who transformed a modest tent healing scam into a perilously devoted congregation. While this method by which he assembled an ardent community of followers and exercises control over their unwavering loyalty worked for him, the style of the documentary paints this as a normal way to build your cult following. It's true that cult leaders do make themselves out to be miraculous to some degree, but not usually in this way. Pastors do it by saying God has given them authority. They normalize their divine task. Getting audience plants to pretend they have been miraculously healed is not as effective nor as common as other methods of using authoritative messaging. In the third episode, titled Reform Their Minds, we go to the Buddha field, and I was delighted to see a familiar face, Radhia, who came on the Cult of Christianity in season 2 to talk about narcissism, cults, and evangelicalism. And she did an excellent job of explaining the power Jaime Gomez had over her and others in the Buddha field. And for those who don't know, Gomez was a failed actor who crafted a following of devotees by offering the prospect of enlightenment. Radhia was one of his primary victims. I recently caught up with Radhia to ask her how she felt she was portrayed in the docuseries. We talked for over an hour, and she is so well spoken about how big these things are. So we're going to listen in. And when she references Holy Hell, that's a documentary that was filmed in 2016 that made the rounds on a few platforms, and I believe it's now on Peacock. And when she mentions Will, that's a fellow survivor who created Holy Hell. I would highly recommend that documentary as well as her book, but here's some highlights from our conversation about the docuseries.
I want to preface this. I love what they're doing in this sense. I encourage people to see the first season, which is How to Become a Tyrant, because their initial motivation, which is the same motivation of why I wrote my book, is they want you to start to see what's happening in this country they try and make it entertaining and they try and make it humorous, just like my book. I want my book to be entertaining. I want it to be edutainment. We don't like sitting in a classroom anymore. So I think that they were very good with their animation and with their humor and delivering a very intense message. I like what their attempt to do. I do. And I admire them for doing what they're doing. But the word cult is so salacious and so interesting. That people are more interested in cults than they are in tyrants and countries that have fallen for tyrants. Because cults are something that isn't happening to them. No, it's happening to those people over there, those gullible fools. People are enamored with stories of cults. And they want to hear the salacious details, the sex and the abuse and the, torture or whatever. They love to hear that because they can keep themselves at an arm's length and they cannot identify why I'm not as thrilled about the second season. And maybe it's because I was a part of that second season. That I am the first season, because the first season is far more important to me than the second season, because the first season right now in this country is happening to 330 million people, not a handful, not 150 like in my group, right? So people are not, I don't think they're going to be as educated in the second season. Like in Holy Hell, for example, in the documentary, Will interviewed me for 4.5 hours. And so with the Netflix, there was even less. They interviewed me for about 2.5 hours. I was happy to do it. And I was happy to do it because I know what their goal is, and that is to try and help people to understand, what this is really all about. I can understand that they're using the technique of animation and humor to deliver something. And I think the critics were being a little bit judgmental, a little bit tough on them. There are documentaries about Jim Jones. There are documentaries about Charlie Manson, et cetera, where they take it very seriously. This was not about those atrocities as much as it was how to become a cult leader, right? So it's really about the cult leader, right? And not the things that he did, but how he did them. I was interviewed a lot when my book came out. And one of the interviewers was seriously disappointed that there wasn't murder or suicides in my cult. One thing that I noticed, John, that I didn't appreciate is that they kept over and over. They wanted more information on the plastic surgery. And that is so incidental to the 25 years of our experience. And they really belabored that. You've got a half an hour, folks, to talk about this, and you're spending a third of it on plastic surgery, which most people, and they kept asking me details of it and all of this other stuff. I didn't have any reference to that. There was very, very little reference to that, number one. And number two, it made it sound like we all were getting plastic surgery and we were all forced to do this from him, which is bullshit. We were nicknamed the cult of the beautiful people because we were. And I don't mean that in any way but this. We were all young for the most part. Early on, we were young. And when we started being young, we had such a disciplined life. We meditated for hours a day. We ate impeccably, had an impeccable diet. I was hermetically sealed for most of my adult life. So I resented the fact that that's all they focused on. We were not beautiful because we all had plastic surgery. I will say this, because I do a lot of videos for my profession. Come on, guys, give me a break. You could have told, there was no makeup, no hairstyle, poor lighting. I mean, I really think if you're going to be Netflix, for God's sakes, I can do a better video of me on my phone. I do want people to remember that, like you said, they're taking it from a different angle. They're taking it from the perspective of how to become a cult leader, not how to become a follower. I wanted people to understand, and maybe it's the same with Manson. I like what they did with Jim Jones, where Jim Jones, the real Jim Jones, was hanging out with prostitutes and doing drugs and whatever. And I like the fact that they showed that he had to cover his ass. It was all about him covering his ass. It wasn't about him, wanting to kill all of these people. He wanted to kill them because he was about to be exposed. I do think that their animation was different. That was a total different way of doing it. And I do like what they did with the animation. Because they couldn't do a dramatization, they couldn't take actors and do what we did. The one thing about the leader, the one thing about all sociopaths is they're chameleons. They figure out you. They figure out what you are and how to manipulate you. So there was probably 120 to 150 members of the Buddha field. There are probably 150 different stories, complete different experiences. The reason why I wrote my book is because when people see Holy Hell, they see Will Allen's experience and they see Ricky's experience. But that wasn't my experience or the women in the Buddha field. We weren't sexually abused. So I would have maybe liked to see in a kind of docuseries, using actors and dramatization, using each person's perspective of what, like I have a friend of mine who's my best friend, Elida. Elida has a whole different story than me. Elida was overweight. And so there was abuse with Jaime with her. He abused her and he publicly berated her and he publicly humiliated her. With me, it was the opposite. There was no abuse. He knew, because of cleansing, he hypnotized us every week. So he knew all of our vulnerabilities. He knew that I had an abusive father and an abusive brother. So how he manipulated me was he became my benevolent male. But her experience, and kind of why she was a little disappointed that Netflix did not ask her, because she made herself available, and I did recommend that they, because she had a different perspective. Anyone who was overweight, which he was to the point, weight was a real problem with him. So he would literally, the only two young girls that grew up in the Buddha field as children, both of them became anorexic by the time they were teenagers because of him. Most of these cult leaders are sexual predators because that's the ultimate of power. When you can have sex with a person, especially who doesn't want it, that is the ultimate predator power that all of them did. Manson did it. Jim Jones did it. They all did it. Trump did it. They all do it. People need to realize it was not until I wrote my book 10 years later, it was not until we all got together and started putting the pieces together and going, hey, wait a minute. When I left the Buddha field, John, remember, like Michael Cohen, I was his consigliere. I knew shit about him that nobody knew about him, and a lot more than I'm even going to say here, right? That's one of the reasons why I was so dangerous to him, because I could have exposed him, and I did actually. When they say in the when they say in the Netflix series, they say there was an email, the infamous email, and one of the elders gave this person information. That was me. I was the elder who supplied the information for the infamous email. I don't know why they didn't say that, because they asked me about it and I was curious about it. I'm like, okay, I'm more than the elder. You just interviewed me. I don't know why, but I was the one that supplied the guy who wrote the email. I'm the one that supplied him with a lot of the information. Most people don't know it wasn't just the email that made him leave. This guy was a real macho kind of narcissist himself, and that's a whole nother story. But he went over to Jaime's house with a baseball bat, and he busted Jaime's door down and took the baseball bat, and Jaime's sitting in his chair, and he smashed up his room in front of him. And this guy was big. He was about 6'3" maybe, and Jaime's a little guy. So this guy smashed that television and he smashed everything, right? This huge violent act that very few people know this. As a matter of fact, I went to lunch with some very old friends of mine that were in the Buddha field. I just told them this story last week. They didn't even know this, right? That was the reason why Jaime left, right? That is why he fled. And so then after that incident, then he wrote the email and the email got to the Buddha field, right? But it was that. I mean, Jaime was like, pack your bags, we're out of here. So very few people know that.
Radhia was overall pleased with the documentary and had no major complaints. She thinks it's a good first step, and with a wide reach, this could lead to potential cult education, even if the series itself is not super thorough, as evidenced by just that 10 minutes of information. We'll hear from Radhia again at the end of this episode. In the fourth episode, titled Promise Eternity, the doc explores the perplexing world of Marshall Applewhite. As a leader of Heaven's Gate, Applewhite concocted a narrative interweaving spiritual concepts with science fiction elements, offering followers the enticement of an impending apocalypse alongside eternal salvation, ultimately ending in a mass suicide. While this cult is fascinating and illustrates how powerful brainwashing can be, it is not indicative of the norm. Cults might promise an afterlife, but they might not. In fact, most cults emphasize transforming yourself now, not the reward of something later. That reward is what I call a gap filler. In Christianity, it's not about getting into heaven. Even Christians will tell you that. But heaven reconciles questions about death and what's the point and where is God now. It's not that followers need eternal life. It's that eternal life convinces you to waste this one. Episode 5, titled Control Your Image, discusses the intricate web spun by Shaku Ashara. As the architect of the Aum Shinrikyo doomsday cult, Ashara deftly blended favorable public relations with deadly tactics. This installment exposes the manipulation of media coverage to cultivate a facade of piety, while he was actively covering up his murders and forcing followers to do the same. It is probably one of the better episodes as far as educating Americans on a cult they may be less familiar with. But the lighthearted tone is uncomfortable and unfunny. This was tragic and should not be a sick interest like some true crime fans inevitably partake in. Also, controlling your image is not always being on the good side of the media. Often, and I'd say more often, it's decrying the media as outside haters who want to attack your group. And most cult leaders control their image by flying under the radar, not manipulating the press. Again, this documentary just doesn't seem to really be clear about what cults are and takes creative liberties instead of honoring what survivors and experts say, even in their own interviews. Concluding the series with episode 6, titled Becoming Mortal, you'll observe the enduring influence of Sun Myung Moon. As an orchestrator of the Unification Church, Moon's skillful maneuvers will be dissected, showcasing his success in molding the organization into a resilient economic powerhouse. Now, becoming immortal is a fascinating aspect of cult leaders in that I do think there is some element of the innate narcissism that accompanies controlling a flock that makes you want to become immortal. But the goal of cult leaders is usually power, and it's an addiction to that power. Some care about their legacy, but some are honestly too busy to care about their legacy. So after the 6 episodes of How to Become a Cult Leader, you're left with cursory knowledge, random facts, and an oversimplification of how cults work. Despite its potential for substance, the show often dwells on familiar ground. Though connections between cult leaders like Charles Manson, Jim Jones, and the leaders of Heaven's Gate are briefly interesting, it leans on cliches, even seemingly ignoring expert opinions stated in the series. Delicate matters like crimes are approached casually, which dilutes the depth needed for these topics. Also, the tactics it lists randomly include strategies like establish your dogma, craft your paradise, and control all information. While those are features of many cults, it's told in a way that serves the narrative of becoming a cult leader, which I think is ultimately the problem that I'll come back to in a minute. And this framework holds its merit somewhat, at least offering the potential for genuine knowledge dissemination and the creation of intriguing associations that transcend mere sardonic observations. For instance, consider this narration, quote, "A great cult leader isn't born, he's made, and how you choose to present yourself to the world can make all the difference." End quote. That's a great quote. It's a great quote, but it also erases the cult leaders who are born into their cults and start as followers and are groomed to become a leader, which is actually a lot more common if you acknowledge that cults are not defined by these 6 extreme examples. The more distinctive value would be in the connections between facet of this approach to the narrative. I like that it tried to make connections. Even though 6 cults are the primary lens, the series briefly references numerous cults ranging from the minor to the global, many of which some people will be unfamiliar, perhaps because the creators are hoping for a second season. However, when crafting a 30-minute episode about individuals who have already been the subjects of 3 6-hour streaming service documentaries, with a significant portion of the runtime reserved for humor in this docuseries, the outcome inevitably remains surface level. This is especially true when considering the significant presence of experts who have already appeared in other documentaries about these same cults and their leaders, whether it's Ivor Davis discussing Manson, Jeff Gwynne analyzing Jones, or Benjamin Zeller delving into the Heaven's Gate pair. The series simplifies much of their expertise into cliches. Evidently, there is ingenuity intertwined with a few interesting connections. However, by the conclusion of the 5th episode, How to Become a Cult Leader has exhausted the satirical reservoir. The 6th and final episode, talking about the Moonies, falls flat. Given the chance to contemplate the 21st century as a fertile ground for both cults and their leaders, with the opportunity to venture beyond the established cult canon in ways that might provoke or challenge or educate, the producers instead opt for a lackluster, anemic episode centered on the Moon Dynasty and the Unification Church. This feeble ending suggests a compromise, potentially due to legal concerns or fears of backlash that would arise if they tackled L. Ron Hubbard, David Miscavige, Donald Trump, or, God forbid, evangelicalism. Yet what surpasses the lackluster wrapping of the central thesis is the decision to broadcast the series without any form of a call to action. Not even a link to a website affiliated with a cult awareness network or a deprogramming organization. The whole thing felt like it was for shits and giggles rather than to educate. Amidst the documentary's underwhelming nature, one commendable aspect stands out. Unlike many cult documentaries that stick to just narrating the events, How to Become a Cult Leader takes a step further by trying to figure out the mechanics behind these groups' operations. And that shift from describing events to understanding their mechanisms is a crucial move. It helps move the conversation beyond a mere retelling of incidents to a deeper exploration of how these cults function. This is precisely what I try to do in my reporting and investigating cults and religion. I'm less interested in sharing salacious details and more interested in caring for those affected and brainstorming preventative laws and preventative education. However, despite this positive direction of the doc, the execution falls short. The documentary often oversimplifies complexities, diminishing the value of expert insights. I think the primary problem is the title and narration device the creators were trying to use. They were forced to follow the pattern of How to Become because Netflix has green-lighted that idea of how to become a tyrant, how to become a cult leader. And I'm sure that green light was based on some analytics of some kind. But here's the fundamental flaw with that framing. The notion of a meticulously laid out step-by-step playbook that guides individuals towards becoming a cult leader is simply non-existent. While this concept may appear intriguing on the surface, a closer examination reveals its inherent silliness, as it fails to capture the nuance and often serendipitous trajectories that many cult leaders inadvertently embark upon. It's crucial to acknowledge that the journey to cult leadership rarely unfolds as neatly as a predefined script. Instead of the calculated architects that this documentary portrays, many cult leaders find themselves thrust into leadership roles almost by happenstance. Their stories often emerge from contexts of survival, evading accountability, or even being ensnared within their own web of deception. For a considerable number of cult leaders, the ascent to power arises from a place of sheer survival. Circumstances like poverty or abuse dictate their path, nudging them into positions of authority they had never intended to occupy. In such scenarios, the image of a charismatic puppeteer fades, replaced by the urgent need to maintain control over a group's dynamics for fear of losing attention, love, or security. Any playbook a cult leader might imagine would have to take a back seat to the pragmatic demands of managing followers. It's not easy to control a group of people. It takes a lot of work and flexibility. Step by step is not how any cult leader operates. It's a dance, not a climb. Furthermore, the notion of a premeditated journey to leadership disregards the intricate tapestry of deception that frequently envelops these individuals as they navigate a labyrinth of lies to evade repercussions or to avoid being found out that they are abusing their power. They might unwittingly find themselves at the helm of a cult by accident. Their initial intent may have been to escape scrutiny, not to gather a following. But even if that was their plan, cult leaders are often afraid of their flock, more than confident that they are putty. I say this not to garner empathy for them, but rather to illustrate that cult leaders are not always clever villains. They're more often pathetic cowards. In addition, a significant portion of cult leaders are groomed by established leaders or influencers within existing cults. These leaders serve as unintentional apprentices, molded by those with more experience who discern their malleability. Their path from follower to leader often unfolds in ways that diverge greatly from any anticipated prediction, reinforcing the idea that such a formulaic approach as a playbook is irrelevant. It's important to recognize that a significant number of leaders rise within long-established cults rather than creating their own. Their ascent is often driven by an intricate interplay of factors including loyalty, adept manipulation, and the shifting dynamics within the cult itself. The narrative of following a predefined script is simply unfounded. While the notion of a meticulously crafted playbook guiding one towards cult leadership might carry an alluring mystique and might help narration at points, it falls short of capturing the intricate and often unexpected pathways that many leaders tread. In reality, a substantial share of cult leaders find themselves in leadership positions due to circumstances that defy the boundaries of any guide. Their journeys encompass survival instincts, spiraling lies, mentoring by other cult leaders, and often an unintentional rise within well-entrenched cults. To fully grasp the phenomenon of cult leadership, one must embrace the diverse, unpredictable avenues that individuals traverse en route to assuming the helm of these groups, and not reduce the story to a sociopath with a script. From the enigmatic Mason cult to the disturbing saga of Jim Jones' People's Temple, a recurring motif surfaces in the form of powerful leaders adept at manipulation and control. This attribute, mirrored in evangelical circles, taps into a profound human susceptibility to persuasion, oftentimes exploiting emotional vulnerabilities to ensure unwavering loyalty. The documentary made cult followers out to be particularly susceptible people, when truly we all are susceptible to being a cult follower, and perhaps given the right circumstances, a cult leader. In cults, the power of influence supersedes the realm of rational discourse, giving rise to a dangerous dependency that binds followers to potential harm. While there is no structural blueprint to forming a cult, there is a layout that is observed after cults are formed. That is a top-down hierarchy that stifles dissent and enforces conformity, whether it be obscure Eastern cults or Western evangelical denominations. The elevation of leaders to positions of near infallibility cultivates an environment where critical inquiry is discouraged and questions remain suppressed. This erosion of independent thought is commonplace in all the cults that the documentary explored, but also in larger groups that many wouldn't even dare call cults. The apocalyptic themes that characterize all the cults in the documentary explored, such as those in Heaven's Gate saga or the Aum Shinrikyo narrative, resonate eerily within certain factions of evangelical Christianity. Doctrines fixated on imminent rapture or prophetic conclusions engender a peculiar fear of the future, often at the expense of present responsibilities. Beyond that, though, I wish the docuseries had focused more on the cultivation of collective identity, which is central to the allure of cults. The fostering of a shared identity while fostering unity inadvertently and intentionally nurtures a climate that quashes independent thought. This phenomenon can lead to a dangerous dependency on the collective for validation, thus rendering dissent or departure from the established norm as coming at a great cost. Cults, including evangelical Christianity, are marked by an insistence on ultimate devotion. Cults demand unwavering allegiance, often exacting a heavy toll on personal well-being. The docuseries touched on this in moments, but devotion was always painted as a feature of the followers that a cult leader could abuse, rather than understanding the all-encompassing nature of the devotion is the abuse itself. This is the important point. Cult leaders don't just cultivate an array of instruments of manipulation, but find themselves leading bona fide systems of abuse. These sinister frameworks lurking beneath the surface peddle and control isolation and brainwashing mechanisms that are beyond mere instances of abuse. Cults are life wasters. Cults don't merely mess around with manipulation, they're maestros of coercive control. They craft an eerie symphony where leaders pull the strings. Isolation isn't some party trick for the cults, it's the main course. They lock their prey away from reality, ensuring that there's no escape from their clutches. Jim Jones did it with the People's Temple, corralling folks into isolated communities where leaving became tougher and tougher and tougher than a jailbreak. That element is no different than evangelicalism, because cults of all sizes have this uncanny knack for spotting your yearnings, your deepest cravings for meaning and connection. They pounce like hungry hyenas, using your vulnerability against you. Take Buddhafield, for instance. Jaime Gomez saw folks wanting enlightenment, so he used their hunger for spirituality as leverage. Pastors of all denominations do the same. Even Christianity, that alleges itself as progressive, isn't immune to the dark allure of cults. It's all about us and theming. It's all about a narrow path, and those who try to widen it might just be desperate for more followers. So cults mess with your head and your heart like a crooked magician. It's a mind-bending dance where your identity becomes a slave to their whacked-out, debunked, and regressive philosophies and theologies. People join cults looking for a spiritual home, and cult leaders exploit that craving for belonging. It's a tangled mess, a relationship where followers cling to the leader's every word, blissfully unaware of the manipulation at play. And honestly, I think the cult leaders themselves are often unaware of all the dynamics. I think they often believe their own garbage and suffer from delusions of grandeur. It just benefits them more than their followers. The structure of a cult is a wrecking ball for your mental health and personal power. They crush your self-esteem and self-worth, leaving you emotionally battered and clinging to them for dear life. Christian cults are notorious for breaking down their members' resolve until they do anything for Jesus, but it ends up being anything for their pastor. Cult structures are a toxic concoction, not just tools, but full-fledged factories of abuse. And the impact of cults reaches far beyond its own confines. Towards the end of our conversation, I asked Radhia to promote her book, which is called The Followers: Holy Hell and the Disciples of Narcissistic Leaders, How My Years in a Notorious Cult Parallel Today's Cultural Mania. What she said when I asked her to promote her book is so important, and what I wish this docuseries could have communicated clearer. I think it missed the opportunity for a lot of important education. And the docuseries might serve as a starting point for discussion, but it's crucial to go beyond the surface and explore the nuances that Radhia's story so poignantly highlights. While we're drawn to sensational narratives, let's remember that true understanding requires a more profound exploration of the human psyche and the intricate dynamics that lead to the formation of cults. But it's not just about her story, or even the stories of those who have been directly affected by cults by being members. It's about recognizing the vulnerabilities that exist within us all and striving to create a society that's more resilient to manipulation.
The reason why I wrote the book is very complex. From the personal standpoint, I really was not clear about what the hell that was, that I did for 25 years. And it wasn't until 10 years after I left, until the movie Holy Hell came out, and I started to get this glaring different perspective, that I said, okay, I've got to understand what my role was in that, and what really happened, number one. And also because that wasn't my story. That's a great story. And Will, man, I know how hard it was for you to do it. And it breaks my heart to hear those kinds of things. And John, afterwards, after that film, he told me the details of his abuse. And I just bawled, because this is my brother. This is the man that I brought to this. And he spared the audience of the details of the abuse, but I'm just like, oh my God, right? So this is 10 years after I left, right? Now I'm getting the bigger picture. So I wrote my book, one, to tell the true story. It's going to take longer than 100 minutes, right? I also wrote it in 3 parts. One, I told in the first part, the journey up to it. How does a person find themselves seeking? What are the nuances of a childhood that leads us to those? So I do bring in the Catholic Church and the early indoctrination. I I'm very clear in starting to use definitions. What is a cult? What is the word brainwashing? And the actual literal definition of brainwashing is you are radicalized in your belief either by imprisonment or torture. None of us were imprisoned. None of us were tortured. Okay. None of us were particularly radicalized. These were beliefs that we came into. These were things that we were searching for. So when were we radicalized? I was radicalized when I came into the Catholic Church at the age of 6. Right? That was the radicalization. So when you think, this person changed your ideas or your mind. No, I was looking for that. Right? And so I found what I thought I was looking for. So I was indoctrinated as a child. And this is what I want to say. When you look at the evangelicals that are doing what they're doing in our government today, it is based on early childhood radicalization. So be very, very careful to think, the MAGA is a cult. No, the MAGA phenomenon started with all of these people early indoctrinated into either their society belief or their religious belief. And so Donald Trump and the Republican Party simply are capitalizing on that and taking out those sections, those Christian sections, and also those extreme conservative sections, and putting them together, right? And if you read things like Dark Money, you will find out who's behind that. They figured out our shtick isn't working, but you know what? This Christian thing, this is really handy. All we need to do is wrap our message into theirs, and we've got it. Perfect. So when I wrote my book, again, it's not about me. I am just using myself and my story as a template. Don't think that this isn't about you, because it is about you and me and all of us that are either victims of what is happening right now and will be. There's 330 million people that will be affected by this giant cult that is happening. This has nothing to do with politics. This has to do with pathology. So I took my expertise as a researcher and my life and parallel it with what's happening today. So if you're offended by hearing that I'm going to talk about Donald Trump, then don't read the book, because I already know what camp you're in. Right? You will not like this book just as like if somebody wrote this about me and Jaime 20 years ago, I wouldn't have liked it either. Right? So that's my point. I'm using me and my story to hopefully, I'm not pointing fingers at you without having 3 fingers pointing back at me. Right? I want to show the world this is how it happens, and it can happen to the best of us. People who interview me, they go, Radhia, it's really interesting after talking to you and reading your book. You're so intelligent. They're really saying, I really expected a gullible fool that I couldn't relate to because I'm much smarter than you, right? No, it has nothing to do with intelligence, and it has nothing to do with education. It has to do with you caught in a trap of a skilled narcissist who figures out what you want and what you need and then just becomes that for you, right? And so they fulfill your imaginary dreams and your indoctrinated needs, and that's what my book is about. That is why I felt I'm taking a big risk by getting on Netflix and by getting in Holy Hell and by writing this book. I feel that it is my responsibility to see my life and analyze my life in hindsight and then splay it out either on the big screen or the little screen or in the library, right? Of here is what you need to see, and I want you to identify with me. That's why I go through my childhood and whatever. I want you to understand that you and I are alike. We have reasons for the choices that we make, and they're much more complex than just saying, I'm following him because he says what he means. No, he doesn't. He does not say what he means. You are being duped. I want to kind of divulge the nuances of this giant, complex situation. That's why I wrote the book. And I wrote it in edutainment. I wrote it as storytelling and as humorous as I could, but not losing the message, And so I'm hoping, God, that people will appreciate it. I'm hoping that will help people to have a better understanding of how this happens, how it could happen. And that's what I like about the Netflix series. If you take it and just kind of, let it open your mind. It's not going to, it probably won't change those who are in it, but it'll help those to understand their friends and relatives who are, and how it happens. They're not stupid. They're not uneducated. They're not gullible fools. When I was in LA, there was a cult on every block. You think I didn't recognize them? A Mooney. I'll never fall for that, right? Or the Hare Krishnas, right? Or Scientologists. Yeah, you think I didn't mock them? You didn't think I thought that they were stupid and gullible? And then I look back at my life and go, did not see that coming, right? So just when you're pointing at all of them out there, you better start looking at what your beliefs and your groupthink is, because your groupthink is dangerous on so many levels. That's what my book is all about.
As we wrap up this thought-provoking journey through the layers of cult education and self-discovery, let's take a cue from Radhia's wisdom. In a world where sensationalism often takes the spotlight, let's not settle for the surface-level allure. Instead, let's dig deeper, explore further, and embrace the complexities that make us human. And instead of watching a crash course on how to become a cult leader, spend your time learning how to debunk myths about how cults control, contain, and convert.
If you'd like to learn more about this podcast or other work I'm doing, go to thecultofchristianity.com. If you'd like to support this podcast, listen, follow, share, and consider subscribing for $5 through Spotify for additional content, or give as much or as little as you can to support this work through links in the show's notes. Every dollar helps further this important discussion as well as start other exciting projects. Thanks for listening, and remember to keep love in your life, hope in your heart, and searching in your soul.